This is Mary Moriarty, Hennepin County Attorney. I wanted to give you some brief context to the podcast you're about to listen to. It is a conversation with Dr. James Densley, who's one of the preeminent experts on mass shootings in the world, actually. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how this conversation came about. As you know, there was a terrible mass shooting at Annunciation Catholic School here in Minneapolis. That happens to be in my neighborhood. And as I was trying to understand and wanted to understand more about what actually happened, I read the shooter's journal. And after that, I asked somebody in law enforcement, actually, how can I understand what's going on, what happens, and most importantly, how can we prevent this from happening in the future? So I was referred to Dr. Densley. He and his partner, Dr. Gillian Peterson, are the creators of the Violence Project, which is a free database with all kinds of information about every mass shooting that's happened in this country. I do want to warn people that the topic is very sensitive, might be triggering for some people, so just be aware that we are going to be talking about a particular kind of gun violence in the community, and that is a mass shooting, like the one that occurred at Annunciation or sometimes occurs at schools, business, movie theaters, that kind of thing. I hope that you find this helpful. Please enjoy the podcast.
Welcome. This is our first live taping of our podcast, We Don't Have to Choose. That name comes from the idea that we do not have to choose between public safety and reform, as long as that reform is based in evidence-based practices and data. So our guest tonight is Dr. James Densley. Please welcome Dr. Densley.
Thanks, y'all.
So Dr. Densley is an internationally recognized criminologist, best-selling author, and leading voice in violence prevention. He is professor and department chair of criminology and criminal justice at Metro State University and co-founder of the Violence Prevention Project Research Center, or the Violence Project at Hamline University. A former NYC teaching fellow and middle school special education teacher, Professor Densley has authored 9 books and edited 2 others, including The Violence Project, How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic, which was the winner of the 2022 Minnesota Book Award and described as groundbreaking. His research has been featured by global media and published in 70-plus scientific journals and 100-plus popular outlets, including the New York Times, The Guardian, Newsweek, Time, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. So thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start out by talking about community violence. We are ultimately going to be talking about what happened at Annunciation, but there's a lot of other type of violence that happens in our community, gun violence. And so you actually started out your career really studying community violence.
That's right. Yes. For a long time, before I ever started studying mass shootings, I studied gang violence, actually, was the lens through which I got to this. And it mentioned in my bio, I'm a former middle school special education teacher, and I taught in the New York City public schools. And it was that experience that got me interested in the lives of young people. And one of the things that was in the periphery of those young lives were the looming prospect of street gangs. So I took that interest into what became my PhD dissertation, which was an in-depth study of gang life in London, England. You might tell from the accent that I'm not from around here.
That does not sound like a Minnesota accent.
Exactly. I could do some ooftas or other things if you'd like me to. But yeah, so I studied gangs in the UK, and what was interesting about that experience is, although they were violent, the vast majority of that violence was knife crime in the UK. When I moved to the United States and started doing my research here, gang violence was mostly perpetrated with firearms. So the pivot went from I'm studying knife crime and street violence to I'm now studying gun crime. And that's, I think, what got me on the pathway to what I study now. Now, the thing about this community violence is often when we talk about gun violence, we talk about it as a singular issue. And really, it's actually a multifaceted one. And for that reason, it needs multifaceted solutions because there's qualitatively different types of gun violence. So you have everyday community gun violence, often perpetrated with illegally held firearms. And the dynamics on the streets are reciprocal shootings. These are back and forth, tit for tat violence. It's retaliatory, it's rooted in street codes, in gangs and other issues as well. But then you have, for instance, domestic homicide perpetrated in a home. That might be perpetrated with legally held firearms, and the dynamics there are, of course, intimate partners. And then you might have, for instance, police-related violence. So you now have when firearms are used against officers and firearms are used by officers. Again, a qualitatively different type of gun violence. You also have the leading cause of death from firearms is suicide. So if you think about that through this lens, that again requires a different set of tools to address. And then you have mass shootings, which are of all these forms actually the most rare, but the most extreme in some ways. And I think that's why they mobilize community conversations, public policy, and so on. But the everyday dynamics of community violence, they touch so many people's lives. And the ripple effects of that are really the most gut-wrenching part of this, because it's violence that people just think happens to them. It happens out there to people that I don't know and in a community that I don't spend time in. And what we forget with this is these are human beings. These are families. They're living with this perennial threat of violence in their communities day in, day out. And if we don't treat that with the urgency that it deserves, it only continues because it's retaliatory, because it's reciprocal, and all the dynamics that are included.
Can I jump in there? I'm glad you brought that up because in our community, we've had probably all of those types of violence. We talk about, or we'll be talking about Annunciation, but the day before that, there was a multiple victim shooting on Lake Street. So it wasn't that far away. And I think perhaps because of automatic, semi-automatic firearms, we are seeing more multiple victim shootings. And that happens way too often. And it often happens in marginalized communities. Here in Minneapolis, that might be North Minneapolis, South Minneapolis. And even though that's much more prevalent, it gets less attention than, say, an Annunciation or other types of violence. But so you've described this umbrella under which all of these types of community violence happen. And I think you were about to talk about what are the commonalities with all of these types of violence?
Well, I mean, perhaps the obvious one is, of course, to say when we talk about gun violence, we're talking about the presence of a firearm. And I think you mentioned that in community violence, one of the things I know that we're seeing more and more of is shootings that are escalated from an interpersonal conflict that in a time gone by might have been a fist fight and now have escalated to a shooting. And even worse than that, are now escalating not just to one shooting, but a situation where you have multiple shell casings on the ground and somebody has sprayed bullets into a crowd. And now you've got, which is a horrible term, but you've got the collateral damage of that, where multiple people are now victims from those crimes. Now, these might be illegally held firearms, but they've also been modified with switches or auto sears, as they're called.
So can you explain what a switch is?
Yeah, so you're turning a semi-automatic weapon, which is legal, but in these cases is often illegally held, if that makes sense. But these are semi-automatic weapons that by virtue of this particular piece of plastic, essentially, that you would adjust the weapon with, turns it into an automatic weapon. So now it can fire at a much more rapid rate. If you combine that with a large capacity magazine, you've essentially created a machine gun, but with pieces that you can just purchase, on the internet. And that's creating a new set of challenges that we've not really seen for a very long time, and in some cases, never before in our communities. But as you also mentioned, this tends to cluster in the most marginalized communities. It tends to affect communities that don't get the groundswell of support and love and outpouring after these events. And then those communities are living with terrible trauma. So we actually did a study. We surveyed 10,000 Americans. That's a really large survey. It was a representative sample. And then we also oversampled for the state of Minnesota. So we got 1,000 Minnesotans as well. So it's 11,000 total. And we asked that general population, have you ever experienced a mass shooting in your community? And 20% of respondents said yes. 20% of that sample. We then asked, have you ever been physically present on the scene of a shooting? 7% said yes. And then we asked, have you ever been actually injured in a shooting? Not just by gunfire, but any sort of injury. 2% said yes. We then asked a little bit more detail about the nature of those shootings, and they weren't really talking about the mass shootings that we think of when we think of a mass shooting.
So you're thinking, or they weren't thinking about school shootings, workplace shootings, that kind of thing.
No, they were thinking of the everyday community gun violence. And you realize this is happening so often to so many people. We're not talking about it. We don't even realize it's happening. And then we, in that same survey, asked about the mental health impacts of that. You know, half to, depending on the circumstances, all of the respondents had some sort of psychological response to this. Post-traumatic stress, panic disorder, depression, anxiety. The ripple effect, 6 degrees of separation we have from these crimes are it's just staggering. To the point where when we got the findings back, we actually thought we'd done something wrong. We were like, there's no way this could be true. So we replicated the survey with 3,000 other respondents. And then secondly, there's been a new replication of a completely different bunch of researchers have used the same methodology to try and get it. They got the same numbers. So we're now at a point where it's like, this is not an aberration of the statistics. This seems to be a fact that, nearly a quarter of Americans are living with some sort of trauma of having had a shooting occur in their community. That's unacceptable.
It is, and it has all kinds of health impacts, all kinds of impacts that maybe when we could do part 2 of this to talk about that kind of violence. Tonight, I wanted to focus particularly on what happened at Annunciation. And we talked about the Violence Project, and you mentioned that the mechanisms of each of these kind of shootings are qualitatively different. Can you describe the Violence Project for people?
Sure. So the Violence Project was a code word for a research study. It was a research study into the life histories of mass shooters in the United States. We defined a mass shooter at that point as anybody who'd killed 4 or more people in a public space. So it was a very narrow definition for a very, I would say, specific phenomena. So we were, in that case, interested in these more indiscriminate crimes, walking into a church, walking into a school, a workplace, indiscriminately shooting at people. We wanted to understand what was underpinning that. So we built a database. The database now includes about 200 individuals, and we've coded them on about 200 life history variables. So that's everything from where they went to school, their parental involvement, the mental health, whether they played violent video games, how they got access to firearms, whether they used SSRI medications, antidepressants, for instance. All the questions that you hear in the aftermath of these shootings, we tried to interrogate them all, basically. But in addition to that, we actually interviewed perpetrators of mass shootings in prison. We also interviewed first responders, survivors, victims' families, people who knew the perpetrators. So we asked their teachers, social workers, anybody who'd grown up with them. We tried to get at this from a sort of 360-degree perspective to really look at these lives in detail and see not only why they did what they did and how they did what they did, but what can we actually do to prevent the next one? And that was really the goal of this project. The Violence Project is about prevention. It's about stopping the next mass shooting.
So you have a lot of data and information that you could put together to talk about not the profile of a mass shooter, but I think we'll talk about the different kind of buckets of things that you see. So I was trying to understand after Annunciation, what kind of person does that? I wanted to understand more. And Drew Evans from the BCA recommended you and recommended your book. I read your book actually after I had read the Shooter's Journal. And I know you've had an opportunity to look at a crowdsourced version of it. Your first chapter really struck me, though. I had been reading this journal, which we'll talk a little bit about, but your first chapter was called Monsters. And it really struck home to me because I remember in the aftermath, you hear things like evil, monster, all of these descriptors of what people think of the person responsible for this. Can you talk about why you named that Monsters, your first chapter?
Yeah, so you're right. There's no excusing the behavior. And what they have done is monstrous, right? I think we can all agree on that. But often in the aftermath of one of these big high-profile shootings that is torn at the fabric of that community and has just devastated so many lives, you'll hear that this person was a madman, a monster, they were evil, they were a terrorist. They use this type of language and it basically explains away the problem because it becomes a circular logic. You can say, well, madmen do mad things and therefore that's why they were a mass shooter. Monsters do monstrous things and therefore they're a mass shooter. It doesn't get us anywhere toward prevention. It keeps us stuck in the same cycle. So the thing that we learned in the course of this research, which really was a shift for us, I think, is to recognize the humanity of the individual before they perpetrated the crime. So before they perpetrated the crime, before they became the monster, they were somebody's son, brother, classmate, colleague, neighbor, and all the way up until the point that they pulled the trigger, they were known as such. So there's part of me that wants to think that if we had got upstream of that problem before they pulled the trigger, recognizing the humanity of the individual, perhaps they would have never pulled it to begin with. And so that's really the message of that chapter, is to say, we're done with creating monsters. We're done with fighting monsters. We're done with run, hide, fighting from monsters. We need to have a point where we're no longer creating them anymore. And that is where the prevention piece comes in.
And I think one of the things I recall from your chapter too is if we're thinking of monsters, that's nobody we know. It's nobody we know. There's nothing we can do about it. They're just these people that we just don't know anything about, but we find out that they're monsters. Instead of people who had certain issues and we'll talk about what those were, that could have been identified. Or that and I thought that by reading the Shooter's journal or diary, that there, in many ways, I kept thinking, and in fact, they were writing a lot of the time, "Someone please stop me." And there was a lot of humanity in that journal at the same time as a lot of things that were entirely horrific. Yeah. But I think forcing ourselves to say, we're not out there looking for monsters. We are looking for human beings who cycle into this, and let's talk about how we can prevent that.
Yeah, it's a block, actually, that we all have. We tell ourselves this could never happen here.
Right.
It could never be anybody I know. It could never be the people right here in front of me because I truly know them. And so my challenge to everybody is I say, do you truly know them? And I think you're right. If we have that block of there's people that do this and then there's everybody else, we miss the warning signs. We don't pay attention to them. And therefore, tragedies happen. And then you hear it every time. Whenever a tragedy happens, everyone always then says, well, there were warning signs and, they missed this and somebody forgot. And it's like, that is the narrative time and time again. So it's that case of like, let's remove the block. Let's remove the blinkers that prevent us from seeing what's right there in front of us, so that we can intervene early.
It has a sense of there's somebody who's evil. They've always been evil, and that explains what this is. So in some respect, it excuses us from actually taking actions that could prevent
Exactly.
what we are seeing all too often.
Yeah, exactly. And in some ways as well, I think it feeds into the sense of hopelessness and despair that we all feel when these tragedies occur. Because in some ways, we're all waiting for Superman to come and fix this problem. We're waiting for the politicians to act or whatever it is. And so it absolves us of any responsibility. But I want to say, like, we can have some skin in this game, which is actually a point of empowerment. It's to sort of say, like, we don't have to feel hopeless about this. We can rightly feel frustrated if the politics are a barrier, but we can also do some small things that can make a big, big difference. And some of that is just being a better neighbor, a better friend, looking out for the people in your lives. If you've got those warning signs in front of you, making those mention of what they are, reporting, and trying to get people connected to the help that they need. Those simple things we can kind of all do without needing an act of Congress or without needing millions of dollars to build a new infrastructure. This is all stuff that we can do for one another, just looking out for each other.
So you developed a framework from which to look at this particular kind of mass shooter. And it comes into, I don't know if you'd say 4 different buckets, but do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, we think about it like a pathway to this. And it's really rooted at first in the self, so the individual. And that takes 2 forms. Number one, we see a lot of early childhood trauma in the lives of these individuals. Now, that manifests itself in different ways. For a lot of people who experience trauma, they deal with it and life goes on. And in fact, they're very resilient and they turn their lives around. But for some, when it's unresolved trauma, it can become really catastrophic. And the other thing as well is often we saw really terrible trauma in the lives of these individuals. Is documented in the book. Some of this is deep abuse and neglect that they've experienced early in life, with no remedy or restitution or anything from this. So that early childhood trauma creates a foundation upon which the second part is a crisis occurs. And it's a crisis of self. It's truly an existential crisis. It's often actually a suicidal crisis. This for us was a big moment of learning in the course of the research, which was to recognize that the mindset of somebody who does this is somebody who's got to a point in their life where they no longer care if they live or die. That is what separates this type of an event from pretty much any other crime. I'll give a frivolous example for you. The heist at the Louvre that we've all been following on social media because it's so exciting, right? That's a very rational crime, right? Why did you steal from the Louvre? Because I wanted millions of dollars, right? It makes perfect sense, right? There's so many times, even a crime of passion, why did you murder that person? Well, because they were sleeping with my wife. You can start to kind of rationalize some things. A mass shooting only ever ends one of 3 ways. 1, you take your own life. 2, it's taken for you by law enforcement because they are first responders on the scene. Or 3, you will spend the rest of your life in prison. There's no parole, there's no nothing, right? And in the vast majority of cases, depending on the state, you'll be executed by the state, right? It is a metaphorical and a literal death is the outcome of a mass shooting. So the mindset of a mass shooter is somebody who no longer cares if they live or die. So it's as much a suicidal act as it is a homicidal act. And that then is rooted in the self. It's the self-loathing. Public acts of violence start in private loneliness. And it's that process of despair that we have to understand that, we use the terminology deaths of despair. When we talk about deaths of despair, we're usually talking about drug and alcohol overdoses, we're usually talking about suicides. I would put mass shootings in that same category. The perpetrators are in that point in their mindset of no longer wanting to live or die. So you've got those first two components. And I was going to pause because I'm sure you'll have a follow-up on that.
Yes. Looking at the journal, it is very clear that this person in the Annunciation case not only expects to die, but actually plans to kill themselves. They make it specific in the journal that they are not going to be caught. And I was pretty stunned by a lot of things in the journal, but stunned at the specificity of that. Like having multiple guns, and we'll talk about the guns, but having a gun in some kind of sling or set up pointed at this person's chin so that the moment they heard sirens, they were going to kill themselves. And that's exactly what happened. And there's a progression in this journal of what happens every day. And this person is writing, I can hardly wait to die. I mean, it is a countdown to relief. And so I wanted you to, that's consistent with what you've said.
It is. And I think in some ways to maybe put a more hopeful spin on that pretty dark phenomena, which is to say, and therefore, the way to prevent a mass shooting is to ensure that people want to live. So if you think about them being rooted in despair, we have to do everything we can to give people a purpose in life, to give people a reason to want to live. And in so many cases, we talk about a lot in the book of averted shootings. So these are individuals who were planning a mass shooting, brought the gun to a school, and were going to do it. What got them off of that pathway that they didn't do it, nothing happened that day, thank goodness, was usually a very simple act of kindness. It was connection, a human intervention. Somebody showed them that life was still worth living. And it was in sometimes the most simple gestures, the most simple connections that got them through those moments. Because we think about that crisis point as being noticeable. It's a change in your behavior. So if you're always mad and then you come to work and you're mad, that's not a change in behavior. That's just Monday morning. But if you are somebody who's always outgoing and enjoying life, and then all of a sudden become very withdrawn from life, that doesn't mean you're going to be a mass shooter, but it does mean that something's changed. That's the moment where you want to intervene. You want to say, is everything okay? And it's asking those hard questions. But what we found with the averted shootings is people were willing to ask the hard questions. They were the ones that did step in and intervene and said, something's not right here. Mm-hmm. And it's giving them a sense of purpose and a desire to live. And if you want to live, you don't do this.
It wasn't, I'm glad you mentioned that, because reading the journal, it was so odd to read it because there was the, I can't wait until this day comes, but there was also someone please help me, actually written in the journal. Somebody please stop me. Somebody please help me. And it was like a cry for help there. And oddly, I kept thinking, oh, I hope somebody intervened. It was just, and I know of course it didn't happen, but it was like, oh, if somebody had done something to intervene, could this have been stopped?
And I believe in the vast majority of these cases, the answer is yes. That intervention is absolutely possible if we can see the warning signs and if we can get ahead of them. But here's where that third component of the pathway comes in, which is, particularly in the modern world, what happens is you're having an existential crisis. You've got to this point where, rooted in deep trauma, you've decided you no longer want to live, and you start to ask these big questions about, why do I feel the way that I'm feeling? Has anyone else felt the way I feel? Why does this keep happening to me? And so what people do is they do what we all do when you have a big question. You Google it. And I know that sounds silly to put it that way, but this is the third step. The third step is the script for this. We have created a script for this form of violence in our society. And it's a script that manifests itself in lots of different ways. So it's a script that, for instance, exists in every single one of our public schools, because you have to do a lockdown drill every 5 times a year, where you're being told in your school building that you might be murdered by a mass shooter. Think about what that does to a generation of young people. Now, for the vast majority of young people, they're going to shrug it off and say, hey, it's no big deal. It's just like a fire drill. There might be a few kids who are actually pretty traumatized by the whole thing. And then there might just be that one kid, 1 in a million, that actually thinks, yeah, maybe I might do this. Let's not forget that the vast majority of these shooters are insiders. They are already familiar with the security apparatus that we've put around our buildings. They're current or former students, current or former employees. They are running through the same drills and the same procedures as everybody else that they are. So we've scripted it in that way.
I'm just going to jump in there, because what struck me about the journal is the shooter talking about the drills and actually saying, I know one of the things I look for, because they tell people to do this, is to lock themselves in a room or barricade themselves in a room and turn off the lights. So I'm going to look for rooms that don't have lights, because people will be hiding in there. And then I'm going to shoot low on the ground, because people will be on the ground because they're told to get on the ground. So it was like a participant in these drills talking about what they have learned and how to make them a more effective shooter.
It's terrifying to think of it that way. But I think that is always what I've argued now for several years, is, sometimes we don't think about, we're doing these things with the best of intentions, because in the absence of public policy, we've decided, well, we have to have a market solution to this. So our market solution is we're going to have more doors and more backpacks and more metal detectors and everything else. But we sometimes forget, what's this doing to that group of young people that are running through this on a daily basis? So you've got the way we've scripted it in our everyday routines, but we've also scripted it on the internet. And many people would look at this and they think about popular culture. So they'll talk about violent video games, or they'll talk about Hollywood movies that depict violence. It's actually much deeper than that. So something that is in these journals is a reference to this sort of gore content on the internet that becomes a gateway into this world. Think of it as a test, if you will. Can you handle it? Can you handle it if you see a beheading on the internet? A real one, by the way, not a staged one. Can you handle it if you watch a live stream of a past shooting? Can you handle it if you live out and live through those past shooters? For the vast majority of us, if we saw any of that content, we'd be totally repulsed and grossed out by it, and we'd close our laptops and throw them away. But again, for that very small minority, they start to realize, I can handle this, and actually I'm becoming numb to it. And it starts to become a pathway where there are gatekeepers on the internet. These are real people who say, oh, you want to see what's behind door number 1? Because we can show you something's even worse. And so now there's a whole community online. They call them the true crime community. For the vast majority of people, again, they're just there because they're interested, intrigued by this. It's not that dangerous necessarily. But again, for that very small minority, you already have all those other risk factors that are at play. You're now in a space where past shooters are idolized, celebrated, heroized. They are canonized. They are sainted on the internet, where people basically, through this sort of gamified culture that young people are involved in now, they're ranking them. Who was the best shooter? Who got the most kills? Who did it best? Who dressed the best when they did it? What weapon did they use? All that content.
Can I stop there before we get in? So the journal, the Annunciation Journal, the shooter talks about watching those videos, and it seemed to be part of their training to be able to do this. And it was what was written in it was I know if I have to watch these things so I know I can actually pull this off. Once I get there, I think I can do it. But it was like, getting them ready. It's like, can I take this? Can I do this? And that's what they watch in preparation for this. It's also very clear throughout the journal that, there are critiques, as you're about to talk about the mass shooters. This person knew all the mass shooters, their names, critiqued them. This is what they did wrong. They were stupid. They were dumb. They did this. And so you were about to talk about
this is
idolization.
Yeah, it's become its own sort of subculture around shootings. And again, for some people, they are drawn to this with a sort of morbid fascination, but it doesn't really go any further than that. This sort of idea of, I'm going to explore this because I find it interesting or intriguing, which in many ways is a bit of a red flag, but they're never going to act on it. But there are some who take it a little step further. And that's where you get this idea of, I'm now starting to truly compare myself to others and actually really see myself in others. And I think that's the biggest piece about this is a mass shooter feels like they are unseen in the everyday world. They feel like the world does not see them for who they really are. In this space, they look at other mass shooters and they identify and see, I'm just like them. And it's that identification piece that gets you over that threshold of, you know what, maybe I could do this because others like me have done it too. In criminology, I teach 15-week-long classes on criminological theory. We talk about social learning and imitation and other processes that go along with this. In psychology, they often call it social proof. It's the idea of when in Rome, do as the Romans do. When we learn how to do things, we copy others. But there is now a copycat phenomena at the heart of these types of high-profile mass shooting crimes. And it's rooted in the sense of identification with past shooters and then wanting to be part of that feeling of belonging. And then seeing, not only can I emulate this, but maybe can I better it? Mm-hmm. And that's where this sort of gamified, performative aspects of this crime come into play.
We were talking earlier about the performative aspect of it. That includes clothing. That includes what kind of weapon. That includes a lot of things where they've studied all about these people and they want to emulate some of them and actually exceed. And they talk about body counts.
The sad reality is high body counts are going to get media attention. They're going to get you noticed. So again, if your feeling is of being unseen, how can I be seen? How can I ensure that my private grievance becomes public? And that's that shift between, although it's rooted in suicidality, at the end of the day, it's still a public act of violence. People often say, well, why didn't they just take their own life? Why did they have to take everybody else's? Mm-hmm. What's different about this is it's a suicide turned outward. It's an angry suicide. It's externalized. And part of that is the performative piece of how do I get the headlines? How do I get the respect and notoriety for this, just like the other shooters have done too? And so there is this fascination with particular shooters. Columbine is the blueprint that so many follow. But they also look at Parkland. They'll look at Sandy Hook, the Aurora movie theater shooting. Some of these more high-profile crimes, even me seeing them out loud, most of you in the audience probably know exactly what I'm talking about. They've got to a level in our culture that, these are now spaces that are forever associated with those crimes. If I say Uvalde, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? And I'm not talking about the city anymore. That's what's sad about this, is that in our culture, these have become spaces where now people can emulate and idolize others and then want to put a new place on the map.
I was struck in the journal by the Annunciation shooter that they wrote kind of a note to media And it was talking about documentaries of previous mass shooters. And what this person had written in the journal was, don't make a documentary about me because that's what I want. There was this desire in the journal to be famous, to exceed, to be among the people who would be emulated after the fact. And I think that's where we really have to worry about. There are people out there following that path thinking, oh, I can emulate this and in fact get a higher body count.
Yeah, it's a lesson, I think, for all of us, but especially for media outlets, social media outlets as well, in terms of what they can do from that prevention standpoint. So when we talk about suicide, there's often a way in which we talk about suicide with a deep sensitivity and compassion. And we rarely, rightly so, talk about the methods and the means and anything else. And the reason we do this, by the way, is something known as the Werther effect. The Werther effect is the copycat phenomena that follows suicides. And we've seen this in very high-profile cases. Marilyn Monroe's death, for instance, there's been studies that have looked at spiking prevalence of suicide after big celebrity deaths. Robin Williams' death, for instance, was another one, where people have looked at the copycat phenomena that follows. So what happens now is when we talk about suicide, we talk about it in a way that always says, if you're struggling or someone you know is in crisis, this is the crisis hotline number. We do it through that lens of prevention and using suicide prevention. With mass shootings, for a very long time, we didn't do that. We put people on the front page of Time Magazine and Newsweek. We turned into Celebrity Watch, where we started fascinating over everything they ever did and as many images of the shooter as possible in lots of different poses and so on. And I think in some ways we helped create the monster with our own fascination with this. I mean, don't get me wrong, we all love a good true crime documentary, right? All of us have got them queued up on Netflix, I'm sure. But with that comes, I think, a sort of darker aspect about what do we post and share and talk about, and what do we buy? Because there's an economy around this as well. Media is profiting from it. Social media definitely is. That in some ways is actually contributing to the problem. So I think from a prevention standpoint, I often say, I try and avoid using the names of shooters, for instance. I don't want to give them the oxygen of publicity.
Isn't that there's a movement, no name or something?
No notoriety.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an example of, and also as well, when we think about media and journalism, and I think this is a good example of that. We are interrogating some pretty dark stuff here on this podcast, but at the same time, I think our lens is really squarely on the prevention side. We're trying to provide solutions. We're trying to provide detailed understanding and not just speculation in some ways. And I think that's something that in the past, the media suffered from a little bit. We had to fill time on CNN. And so it was, let's just speculate for, days and days and days and days, and see where it takes us. And I think in some ways that feeds the myth, it feeds the narrative. And it's especially bad now on social media because, in many ways, those things, it's now algorithmic is the way in which we engage with this content. Because that's the other piece about this as well is, I mentioned before, when you're having an existential crisis, you Google it. The algorithm is set up now to feed you what you like. So if you're in a dark space and you're looking at dark content, gore content, past mass shooters, it's going to keep feeding you more because it knows that's what you like and it wants to keep you engaged. There's a profit motive for social media platforms to keep you watching the stuff that's actually going to take you down these dark pathways. So I do think there's a responsibility there for social media companies to do a better job with how they manage this, but also as well just for parents and educators to be aware of this content. So when they encounter it on their child's laptop or on their social media page, or even in the avatar or the hashtag that they're using on a social media post or the clothing that they're wearing.
So you and I talked about that before we were up here, that maybe the social media handle is the name of one of the mass shooters. Maybe they talk about that mass shooter like somebody would talk about a singer, a popular culture, a singing group, or a sports person or something.
Exactly. And there's fan art associated with this and all sorts of things, which, if you don't know the names, you don't know what you're looking at, you might dismiss this as, just the musings of a teenager and nothing to worry about. But for somebody who reads these names and thinks, you know what, I think I've seen this before, that can be that opening gambit for intervention, because you can then start to ask those questions. Why do you feel so interested in these individuals? What is it that you're drawn to? You're coming from a place of curiosity, not punishment. But the idea is to open up those conversations where you might then be able to interrogate a little deeper and hopefully get somebody off of that pathway.
The Annunciation shooter had written that when they were, and I think this happened at Annunciation when they were attending school there, they were doing an assignment, I think on their computer, and a pop-up about a mass shooter came on. And that started their fascination with mass shooting. And it was something on their mind for years, obviously. And they became obsessed with it. And we're asking questions like, do other people think about this? And also specifically said, I can't go to a therapist because they'll report me. And so when we're talking about that intervention, I'm wondering, when you're talking about that conversation out of curiosity, is there something to trying to make it okay to talk about the fascination, or just so, hey, you're not the only person in the world and people have intrusive thoughts and that's okay?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, the sad thing is, and no one's going to want to hear this, but I'm a parent myself. You have to now assume exposure to things that you wish your kids had not been exposed to. For exactly the same reason you just mentioned, it just popped up. It's not difficult to two swipes on YouTube Shorts, and all of a sudden you're tumbling down the rabbit hole somewhere into content you never expected to be. So our young people are going to be exposed to gore content and newsreels and things that they don't quite understand on a pretty routine basis. So from a parent standpoint or from a teacher standpoint, anyone who's engaging with young people, I do think it is important to assume exposure. Don't go into it naively thinking like, no, my kid will have never seen pornography. They have. They've seen it, probably from a very young age. So assume that they've had that exposure. Open it up. We're not punishing you. We're opening it up for an honest conversation. The other thing as well is, let's leverage the fact that our young people are the experts in this. They understand social media, the meme culture on the internet, because I think this is the other thing. You and I had talked about this previously. There's something about this generation of mass shooters. There was a time historically where people would post manifestos. Manifestos are declarative statements. Manifestos are meant to move people to action. This generation now posts memes. Memes are ironic in-jokes. They are speaking to a very specific in-audience. It's saying, it's a wink and a nod to those who know. It's a way of saying, like, the rest of you guys are not going to get this joke, but you, right there at the back, you will. And that one person is who you're talking to. I think in the Annunciation shooters' writings, it reads like that. There's a lot of stream of consciousness, but also this sort of like narration, like they're narrating a story to this one person that might just understand what it is that they're talking about. That's that kind of meme culture here. So what I was getting at is, who are the best at understanding what the memes are? It's young people, because adults have got no idea what's going on. So the more we can come at it with that curiosity of just sort of being like, hey, I'm a boomer, I don't know what I'm talking about, and have young people explain it to you. Ask those questions about, what content have you been exposed to that you didn't like recently? Who are the influencers that you trust on social media? The answer is none of them. But the point being is, ask those conversations of our young people. Get them engaged in conversation. Don't just assume because they're locked away in their bedroom on the internet that they're safe. We've got to, as adults, take a little bit more ownership on that. And I think in the case here, you can see that there is this sort of sense of, again, the cry for help, but it's sort of a self-narrated cry for help because no one really knows what's going on. And it's about being curious enough to ask those difficult questions and find out.
Let's talk about the last bucket there, opportunity.
Yes. So this pathway, childhood trauma, crisis point, existential crisis, you've got the scripting that occurs with this. And then finally, it's the opportunity. As we started this conversation back at the beginning, we talked about the one commonality that all these forms of gun violence have is access to firearms. Now, when I say that out loud, half of the room is now pigeonholed me as some sort of, anti-Second Amendment guy and has stopped listening. And that's the problem with this, is that there's a deep division in the way we talk about access to firearms that I think doesn't understand the complexity of the challenge. Opportunity is a crucial component of this, but it's not the only component. As I mentioned, there's 3 others. We can intervene in all those different levels, but to then say, and therefore we should do nothing with opportunity, is also a false dichotomy, is a false narrative. We have to address all of it if we're going to be successful. So what opportunity looks like is, of course, access. It's access to people and places, but it is also access to firearms. And in these particular cases, how this usually comes about is if somebody is a minor, they get access to a firearm because of a negligent adult. That's the common through line in this. It is an adult who has failed to safely secure a firearm in the home, or it's an adult that's bought their friend a gun or let them borrow it, and then it's used in a crime. So that is a very easy prevention piece. It doesn't need any act of Congress or anything. It's just a very simple one of, friends don't let friends borrow your gun. Don't leave your gun lying around. If you've got teenagers in the house, that's a very simple public health message that can be advanced. But of course, as people get older, they can purchase their own weapons. And I think that's the other thing that's qualitatively different about this form of crime, which is for everyday community violence, these are often firearms which are possessed by people who already shouldn't have access to them, have been prohibited. They're prohibited persons, to use the technical term. For mass shootings, they usually are purchased legally. Someone has gone to the gun store and they have purchased it with the intent to use it in a mass shooting. And what's complicated about that is, everybody's a law-abiding gun owner until the moment they're not. Right?
Right.
So then you have to ask the question of, so what more can we do to ensure that when somebody is on that pathway to violence, that they're in crisis, they're being radicalized on the internet, the warning signs are there, that is not the time for them to be purchasing a firearm. So there's some things that we already have. Minnesota has, for instance, extreme risk protection orders, red flag laws, as they're known. If you know a loved one who's in crisis, whether it's a suicidal crisis or a homicidal crisis or whatever that crisis looks like, you can petition a court to have their access to firearms temporarily removed until they're no longer in that crisis. It's a fantastic tool. We need to use it more often. We need to understand it and use it more often.
I'll jump in there. Our office, we've hired a coordinator for ERPOs, and we have a toolkit for ERPOs, I think on our website, we can provide that. And it's got all the information that you need to understand ERPOs. And if you call our office, we can help walk you through it too. So yeah, that is important.
It's a great tool. Is it going to solve all gun violence all the time? No, of course it's not. But anything we can do to slow that pathway for opportunity is an improvement. The other thing, though, that is striking in these particular cases is a sort of twofold phenomena with the type of weapon that gets used in these events. So in everyday community violence, it's actually quite rare to see what you might call an assault style weapon. Now, again, some people will push back on that concept. They'll say there's no such thing as an assault style weapon. It's a manufactured concept by the political left and by the media and everything else. But what we're really talking about is a weapon that would have been banned under the assault weapons ban that was in effect federally from 94 to 2004. It is a weapon, with a detachable magazine and certain features that is really a civilian version of a military style weapon. Okay, that's what we're talking about when we use that terminology. And we're very precise in our definitions in the database, for instance, about how often those weapons are used. And in the cases of mass shootings, they appear in about a quarter of the cases. So about a quarter of mass shooting cases involve those types of firearms. In everyday gun violence, it's less than 1%. So there's something about a mass shooting that seems to be perpetrated more often with these types of firearms. So the next question, of course, is why? On the one hand, there's the utility of the weapon. We see this in the writings of the Annunciation shooter. They talk about wanting to purchase a weapon that has sufficient firepower and utility, modularity, that is, the right size, the right shape, that can inflict the most amount of damage. So there's something about the utility of the weapon that is important here. These are weapons that are designed to be very efficient and very lethal. But there's another component of this as well, which it goes back to the performative aspect of these crimes. If you want your mass shooting to conform with the expectations of what a mass shooting looks like in the public domain, you have to use the same props that the past performers have used in their performances. And so again, in the writings of the Annunciation shooter, they will talk about the guns that the other shooters before them have used. And what you start to see, quite interestingly, is they begin in their writings, in the earliest writings, with almost a very little rudimentary understanding of firearms. I mean, they clearly don't know what they're talking about. They're not talking about a military expert they're not a firearms instructor, right? Over time, you start to see a growing fascination with certain types of weapons. And the reason for that fascination is because those weapons are associated with past mass shootings. And then there's a sense of, how do I make my mass shooting live up to the other ones? I've got to follow the script. I've got to follow suit. So there's a copycat component to this use of assault weapons that I don't think anyone talks about, which is to say that these are weapons that are also marketed to impressionable young people in a certain way as being efficient killing machines. But when you add on top of that the mystique around these weapons, because they've been used in past mass shootings, you then start to see that there's more to this phenomena that runs deeper. And so, as controversial as the conversations around an assault weapons ban are, the data will tell us that for mass shootings, it could well make a difference.
More than the data tells us that, the Annunciation shooter actually told us that. In the journal, the Annunciation shooter talked about, if you want to stop mass shootings, make guns harder to get. And there's video of them in guns. They wrote in the journal, yeah, today I went to so-and-so and I was waited on by Sam or whatever. And he was really helpful. And I bet he doesn't know what he's helping me do. I mean, the level of detail about guns, the pictures that were drawn is, this went on for weeks. This journal went on for weeks. And the saving the money to get a certain kind of gun was just, to me, astonishing, because I had never read anything like that before. But I was telling you earlier, I think anybody who says guns aren't the problem should have to read this journal.
It's striking. In some ways, the saddest part of this, which, if we're going to create and live in a society where access to these types of firearms is so readily available, it seems that we've just sort of resigned ourselves to the fact that therefore this is just going to happen and it's going to keep happening. Large capacity magazines, they're large enough that I can write the names of all the past mass shooters on them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is literally what they did. And are we going to accept that as being okay? Because what ends up happening is this cyclical repeating of the phenomena, which again, the Annunciation shooter alludes to and writes about with this narration of they're looking down on us almost and saying, and I can predict what's going to happen next, which is to say, this terrible tragedy is going to unfold. Everybody's going to come out with their thoughts and prayers. They're going to say, yeah, we really should do something about this. And then nothing will happen. And then somebody, that person at the back of the room that I was talking to when I wrote on the gun, that person that I referenced in the meme that only they got, is going to look at me just the same way that I looked at that other shooter and say, yeah, they're just like me. And they're going to go and do it. And then we're going to repeat. We're going to have more thoughts and prayers and more inaction, and the cycle just continues. It's Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That's what we've done for, 26 years post-Columbine. We've done the same thing over and over again and expected different results. And I think we have to maybe now look at this and say, is there not something more we can do? Is there not something more we can do to prevent this from happening?
So I want to talk about another aspect of opportunity. I was also stunned by the level of planning that the Annunciation shooter did. Down to the sitting, for those of you who are familiar with Annunciation, there's a Starbucks on the corner. Sitting at that Starbucks at the time, between the time they were going to perpetrate this shooting, and looking to see how many Minneapolis Police Department squads went by. They knew every door. They had drawings of things. They actually knew the door was locked. And so they purposely went by the stained glass. Where they went and shot was planned. They knew everything about this. And so I was stunned by that level of detail. And they had been in and out and talking to people and just studying, where can I, and a lot of it is, where can I get the most damage? And a lot of it was that they even wrote, I think I have X number of minutes. And they actually targeted young children because they wrote that young children couldn't fight back. And so they were thinking, okay, how long before I hear the sirens? How long do I have to commit the most damage? And then as soon as I hear sirens, which is exactly what happened, they shot themselves. So I wanted to talk, just to kind of wrap up on, the idea of, hey, we need to, and I think it's sometimes referred to as hardened schools, school resource officers, what have you. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that many of these mass shooters are not criminal masterminds, right? And I think the other interesting through line with all this is, I referenced previously Columbine. Columbine was its own copycat shooting. Columbine was intended to be a bombing. It was intended to be a bombing that was inspired by the Oklahoma City bombing. Now, here's another fun fact. Oklahoma City bombing was inspired by the Waco tragedy. It's a copycat crime of a copycat crime that created a phenomena of copycats, right? The bombs never went off at Columbine. It's a failed bombing that became the most famous school shooting ever. I use that as an example because these are not criminal masterminds, right? That have got this planned out like Ocean's 11 or the guys that broke into the Louvre. But they are planning. And the reason they are planning is because the vast majority are very familiar with the places that they target. Human beings are creatures of habit. The old adage is, you always hurt the ones you love. There is this sense of, when mass shootings unfold, they tend to unfold with perpetrators that are already very familiar with the spaces that they that they attack. Some of that's by virtue of just routine. They've been there before. They've walked through the doors 1,000 times. They know exactly the routines, the procedures. They've been in the lockdown drills. They've done everything. And then some of it then is then added a little bit of additional interrogation and casing the joint and other things to add layers to this. So your question was, so what does that mean for the multi-billion-dollar school safety industry? Which is to say, the school safety industry doesn't seem to follow the data on who the school shooters are. The school shooters are school children. And so many of the technologies are unproven. Everyone's now gravitating toward AI because AI is everywhere, right? There was just a case in this country just in the last week where kid brought a bag of Doritos to school and the AI weapons detection software thought it was a gun. And so that kid was then held at gunpoint by police officers, which is far more traumatizing, for the fact that they were bringing Doritos into school. The AI weapons detection software is not sophisticated enough to actually detect weapons, right? The metal detectors, they're not detecting the weapons when the vast majority of shootings that have occurred at schools, mass shootings, actually started outside the building. Again, they'd know that if you looked at the data. It's on our website, it's free, just download it, right? The Annunciation shooting shot through the windows from the outside, okay? The metal detector's not catching that. What are we going to do? Put bulletproof glass in the stained glass windows of a church? I mean, you get to the point of absurdity where it's like, oh yeah, I guess we could turn everything into a fortress and then we'd be safe. It's again, I think, the failure of imagination and the failure of public policy that gets us to this point. So I say this with my best British accent. It's quintessentially American that you would find a market solution to this problem, right? Instead of actually really addressing a lot of the underlying root causes that got somebody on that pathway to violence in the first place and then got them access to the firearm that they could perpetrate it, we've created an industry around this phenomena that puts all the emphasis on the backs of school children, teachers, administrators, school districts, scrambling to do something because parents are crying out for something. And it's better to be seen to do something than nothing.
I noticed that in your research, you talk about school resource officers and that there have been cases where people have gone to a place with a school resource officer or an officer because they wanted to be shot, killed.
Exactly. Again, I say, follow the data on this. As I mentioned, the mindset of a mass shooter is somebody who no longer cares if they live or die. We actually have the words of mass shooters that have said, the reason I targeted these locations is because I knew that a school resource officer or a police officer would be present and they would shoot and kill me. It's part of the plan. Deterrence doesn't work in the traditional way when you don't intend to live. You can't deter somebody when they've at a point where they no longer care if they live or die. So again, it's one of those things of if we follow the data, we can see that those are not going to be the solutions that fix this. So then you get to the point of like, well, so what is? Where do
So I'll jump in there. The title of your last chapter is Hope.
It is, because this whole thing is a little dark, right? I mean, you've come out here on a Tuesday evening, and it's a pretty dark conversation. And reading the letter and everything that you're in a dark space with this. But the last chapter of our book is titled Hope, which may seem odd, but after spending years immersed in the lives of mass shooters, survivors, first responders, we actually, myself and my colleague Gillian Peterson, my co-author on this, we came away from it hopeful. First and foremost, because we want to send this message. I've said it once, I've said it a million times, I'm going to say it again, okay? Mass shootings are not an inevitable feature of American life. They are preventable. They are preventable. So that's the first piece of hope, is that this can be prevented. The second thing is it can be prevented on multiple different layers. So yes, there's some things that might need an act of Congress. There might need an act of the legislature. We might need somebody to move on something. But there's also things we can all be doing at the institutional level and on the individual level to get upstream of this problem. And that really speaks to those root cause issues that I mentioned. So if we think about the scripting of this in our society, what more can we do to change the script? So that's on all of us. What we consume, the products we buy, the stuff that we like on social media, the conversations that we have with our young people, all of that feeds into this. In Minnesota now, there is a law around trauma-informed active shooter drills. It's a little known law. I don't know if everybody knows this, but maybe they will now. Is now when we do active shooter drills in Minnesota, they have to be trauma-informed. There has to be some debrief about this. They can't do active shooter simulations in Minnesota. They are banned. A simulation is where you would have a crisis actor pretending to be a mass shooter, and you'd have students in the hallway with blood and gore all over them. You think I'm making this up? In some places, they were doing this. You can't anymore in the state of Minnesota. That's changing the script on this type of violence. The other thing we can do is getting ahead of the crisis point, the existential crisis, as I mentioned, and the childhood trauma. Giving people purpose, giving them something to live for is vitally important. We can do that in our institutions with after-school programs, extracurricular activities, sports teams, anything that gives people a sense of belonging in the world. Places of worship, churches. I mean, that's what's so heartbreaking about the Annunciation shooting is not only is it a school, it's also a place of worship. And these are sacred spaces where community is central. We've got to get that community back. You know, it's 30 plus years since Robert Putnam said we were bowling alone. Those lessons are still there. The Surgeon General calls loneliness an epidemic in this.
Previous
Surgeon General. Yes, that's right. Called loneliness an epidemic in this country. In Japan and in Great Britain, there are loneliness ministers, government figures whose job it is to address loneliness. That's how bad our lives have become. That we're all a little lost and lonely now. So that reconnection, that human connection is really where the solutions are going to lie. The more that we can do to get particularly our young people connected off of those dark spaces on the internet and giving them a sense of purpose and belonging, that's where the action is, and that's how we prevent these.
Hi, I'm Mary Moriarty, the Hennepin County Attorney. You've just listened to my conversation with Dr. James Densley, and we talked about the Annunciation mass shooting as well as the characteristics of all other mass shootings that have come before it. You now know that there are ways that we can prevent this, both on an individual basis and as a community. And what we need is help from the legislature. So going into this next session, you all know that many of these mass shooters favor assault rifles. So we know that we can keep those out of the hands of people who might be mass shooters with legislative action. So please take this podcast and circulate it to your friends, family members, and people who are concerned about how we can prevent another mass shooting from happening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. Thank you.